morning and welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to those who know that the world's political, religious, media, military, and economic institutions are rotten to the core, that they are the problem, and that therefore there can be no religious, political, or military solution to what ails our planet. Therefore, our mission is to look behind the headlines, to know who is perpetrating the crimes, and to try to figure out what we can do as individuals to slow the destruction that they are proposing. And as a result, in our second hour, we're going to use evidence and reason to explore the Torah, because its covenant provides the only reliable answer. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion, it's toll-free. You're welcome anytime over the next 2 hours. It's 877-300-7645. A friend of mine sent me an email this morning. It was an announcement of the Feast of the Circumcision of Christ. I had to laugh at this particular news item, but since it ties in with the new year, I thought I would share it with you. They claim that this is now Orthodox Christianity. This is a feast that is celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Anglican Church, as well as all Lutheran churches, indicating that these Christians can't count. They claim that, of course, their God was born on December 25th, and that 8 days later, on January 1st, that he was circumcised. They say that it was in obedience to biblical law. Now, we'll speak to obedience to biblical law in a moment, but you can use your own fingers and you can count from December 25th to January 1st, and you will not get 8 days. It is 7 days. So they do have a problem with the math here, but they, of course, want to tie in the celebration to the Roman god Janus, the god of new beginnings, with their god, who was based upon the life and times of Dionysus. It is also interesting that they say that he did this in obedience to biblical law. Now, mind you, if he did this in compliance with the Torah, then he was Torah observant. And if he was Torah observant and they're not, how is it that they could be following his example? Now, mind you, that there is no word obedience in Hebrew. So it is impossible for God to have communicated to us that he wants us to be obedient. Bible is the name of a pagan sun goddess, so that certainly isn't a term that God would have used. And Torah means teaching, not law. They didn't get anything right, including Christ, which is nowhere close to being a transliteration or a translation of the Messiah title. Messiah means the work of Yahowah, and Christ is drugged, the applications of drugs in Greek. But it is an indication as to just how lost one has to be to engage in, participate in, believe religious literature, to celebrate religious ceremonies. It is an indication that it is impossible to be aware and to be rational and to be a Christian. This next story was sad and, written to me as from a friend saying, I thought this story was kind of funny. I'm going to look at it as sad instead. It said that he goes on to say, the person who sent me the email, it says the people responsible for defending our freedom can't even do 3 pull-ups. Apparently, the Marine Corps is now allowing women to just hang from a pull-up bar for 15 seconds in order to pass the physical training test. So, here we are training Marines to allegedly defend our freedom, and so long as they can hang from a bar for 15 seconds, that's good enough. That makes you feel safe. Indeed, that is the voice of Shane. Shane is first day on the job for us, not the first day on the job. He has been in radio and with GCN for quite some time, but he is new to our program, and I encourage Shane to participate as Scott had done during the year that Scott was with us. So welcome, Shane. It's good to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot on this program is the fact that our military actually isn't defending us. America has fought 101 wars in the 400 years since the Europeans came over to colonialize this continent. And that you really can't find a good example of a war that America's military has been used that has defended American freedoms. And of course, the last half a dozen wars that America has fought have the excuse can't even be rationally made. But there is an issue with women not being strong enough to defend themselves in the U.S. military, and that is that 80% of women in the U.S. military are sexually harassed, and that is one of the greatest crimes in our country. It's a crime that we're doing absolutely nothing about. That women in the U.S. military are more likely to be sexually abused than any place on the planet other than in a Islamic war zone. And that's flat out inexcusable. We heard in the briefing of the news this morning that the United States is in a freezer. This has been an extraordinarily cold winter. The coldest temperature in the Earth's recorded history was recently recorded in Antarctica, 138 degrees below zero. That's chilly. And this particular summer, the man-made global cooling advocates had told us that global warming advocates, that the global warming would be so severe by this time that this summer, as we transition from summer to fall, it would be the first time that the polar regions would be ice-free in the Arctic. And in fact, the ice pack in the Arctic, in the northern hemisphere, was 60% beyond where it had been in recorded history. So we are really in a very significant period of global cooling. Now, this global cooling is taking place, as we know, in a period of global warming, something we have talked about in previous shows, that the Earth, for as long as we can remember, has, not as long as we can remember, as long as we can investigate, has gone through, on average, 1,200 to 1,500 year cycles where the Earth gets much warmer, and then it gets much cooler, followed by much warmer and much cooler. In terms of the periods of recorded history where this has happened, the rise of the Greek civilization was during a period of global cooling, which would attest for the fact that why a civilization that was island-based and a peninsula-based, which was insulated considerably from the cooling that was affecting the rest of the world, would be more empowered than other countries. Rome, which went, of course, north through Europe, rose in power during a period of global warming. Following the demise of Rome came with a period of global cooling that was to coincide with the Dark Ages. The medieval period was a period of prolonged global warming. This was followed by the Little Ice Age, which was a period of very severe global cooling and major disturbances to human activity that concluded around 1875, at which time we entered what would historically be a 600 to 700 year period of global warming. That's why the ice sheets and glaciers retreated with photographs taken around 1875 compared to those taken around 1980 to 1990. However, in the midst of this, what would be a period of global warming, we have now entered a period of cooling. The last 30 years, the temperature of the Earth has not changed so much as 1/10 of a degree. But during the last 3 years, it has actually cooled. So if man is affecting our planet, we're making it cooler, not warmer. We are in the midst of changing a global trend that has been around for millions of years. Certainly something to think about. Now, there was an item that wasn't on the news, but I want to cover it because it is so insightful relative to what's happening in the Middle East. It reads as follows. Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan says that he favors the retrial of hundreds of military officers convicted of plotting to overthrow the government. Now, the reason this story is interesting is that Erdogan is credited by liberals for having done something to establish a genuine democracy, we'll put that in air quotes, in Turkey, that had heretofore been never done previously. And what he did is that in Islamic countries, almost all government is by military junta. You know, if you look at Saddam Hussein, military dictatorship. If you look at Gaddafi, military dictatorship. If you look at Assad in Syria, military dictatorship. Egypt, military dictatorship. That's the norm in Islamic countries. Even in Saudi Arabia, where we have a fiefdom, the Saud family came to power by forming. They were warlords. They were the most militant warlord in Arabia, and they formed an alliance with the Wahhab religious sect of Islam and formed their power base. And they were then armed and abetted by the British during World War I to go against the Turks. Now, in the case of Turkey, Turkey was previously the Ottoman Empire, which was a military dictatorship. And the Ottomans came to control Turkey by force of arms. As it turned out, the most powerful force for better part of 1,000 years on Earth were the raiding parties of the Mongols. Well, Tamerlane decided that he would mix Islam and the Mongolian raiding style together, and he became the most vicious of all barbarians. And in this process, these Mongolians, who are now Muslims, came in and destroyed what was left of the Byzantine Empire and formed what was called the Ottoman Empire. Now, we will turn to Erdogan in a moment. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're considering the reversal of action by Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan. It is interesting here that, as I say, that Erdogan is credited with neutering Turkey's military, and that was considered a democratic achievement. Now, mind you, and we have to be careful here with our terms, Turkey is not a democracy. There are no democracies on planet Earth currently. There have been 2 democracies that we know of. One of those was Sparta, which was the most savage country probably ever in human history in terms of being ruthless and uncivilized. Sorry to you Michigan State fans that have Spartans as your mascot, but the Spartans used their influence to enslave their neighbors. They treated women as if they were nothing but factories to make new soldiers, kind of like a Muslim woman and a suicide bomber to be. And they were, with their men, unbelievably brutal. And so that's the world's longest-lived democracy. The Delian League, which was a outgrowth of Greece, was also a democracy. It was established for the same reason that America is using the term, although America is using the term incorrectly, as a buffer to war. Greeks thought that if they could get the islands to the east of them to accept, in fact they imposed their choice of governance on them, that when the Persians attacked, they would serve as the canary in the mine and provide an alarm, a warning, and a slowing tactic that would give the Greeks more time to defend themselves. But the imposition of choice did not work, and the Delian League crumbled relatively quickly. In a democracy, people actually legislate. That's the nature of a democracy. In a democracy, people, the population who is invested in the culture, it's usually, these democracies are all oligarchies. It's people who are invested in the nation, making a contribution to the nation, vote on all manner of things. They vote on budgets, so all spending, all international treaties and agreements they would vote on. Every aspect of government is decided by the people, not by elected representatives. We do not have a democracy in America. This is, at least it was, a representative government, and based on a constitution that America chooses to ignore. But silencing the military in an Islamic country was considered a major coup for Erdogan. Now, the problem is that the people who wrote that line for CNN are the same people who do not understand what the consequence was of removing Saddam Hussein, for example, from power. And that is that if you remove a stabilizing influence from a country that is inherently unstable, you get a bad thing rather than a good thing. So trying to do something that you think in isolation is good, you make a bad situation much worse. And in the case of Erdogan, he is a fundamentalist Muslim. His AK party is an Islamic party. And so what he has done is he has replaced the moderating influence of the military in an Islamic country with the caustic, the enraged nature, the irrational nature, the uncivil nature of Islam in that country. And so he's actually made the situation worse. And as we have learned, since Islam means submission, since the Quran tells Muslims that they have no free will, that they have no choice in religion or governance, and since the Quran tells jihadi Muslims to kill any Muslim that rejects their faith and that does not follow the Quran, what we recognize is that when Islam is increased in influence and the military is decreased in influence, a country goes further away from freedom, which is what actually happened and is happening in Turkey. Now, so why would Erdogan, who was the responsible party for trumping up false charges against his military, having killed and incarcerated many hundreds of generals in his military, why now is he saying, maybe we ought to have a new trial? Well, you see, nepotism and corruption are running rampant in Turkey. It is recently that Erdogan has been fighting for his survival because his children and the children of his cabinet members have all been stealing from the government. And the judiciary wants to hold them accountable and Erdogan himself accountable. So what he's saying is, well, maybe if we retry my opponents, the judiciary will give me a break. We're going to migrate ever so slightly south from Turkey to Syria. This story comes to us from Reuters. It is a story that I see as being related to the New York Times propaganda, suggesting that a movie was responsible for the Benghazi attack and that it wasn't al-Qaeda. This story from Reuters. Syrian rebel fighters loyal to al-Qaeda ceded ground near the Turkish border to rival Islamists on Sunday. activists said, in what seemed to be a tactical withdrawal to end clashes between Syrian and foreign-led opponents of President Bashar al-Assad. Now, there's just so much misinformation here, it boggles the mind. As we considered the story that took place in Libya, where the New York Times said that this was a spontaneous attack on the U.S. Embassy based upon a derogatory film of Islam and not al-Qaeda. What we find is that if there was a Islamic terrorist organization linked to al-Qaeda, the most loyal to al-Qaeda on planet Earth right now would be Ansar Sharia. Ansar Sharia is the terrorist organization that planned and perpetrated the killing of the American ambassador in Benghazi. And we know that because the Egyptian government published some 30 letters between al-Zawahiri and the Leaf of Allah, which is the fellow that is the head and founder of Ansar Sharia. If there is any Islamic terrorist organization in the country that can be associated with al-Qaeda, that the term fighters loyal to al-Qaeda is appropriate, the single most would be Ansar Sharia, because of the correspondence and the fact that the Leaf of Allah, its founder, continually expressed his personal and undying loyalty to al-Zawahiri, probably the lone remaining individual from the original al-Qaeda organization. There is no such correspondence between any other Islamic terrorist organization. Matter of fact, what we find is the two Islamic terrorist organizations that bear the al-Qaeda name today, and there's only two. One is al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the other one is al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, which is that area of sub-Saharan Africa. That in the case of both of those two, bearing the al-Qaeda brand, that Osama bin Laden, prior to his murder by American troops, had his robes in a tizzy twit over the fact that they were using his brand without heeding his advice. And he was constantly scolding them for not listening to him, for paying no attention to them. And in his correspondence to them, he said, I want no association with you whatsoever. So the two that bear his name have no association with Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. But the organization the New York Times wants us to believe has nothing to do with al-Qaeda was absolutely in cahoots with them. Now, in this particular case, as we have talked so many times on this program, al-Qaeda as it originally was formed was very relevant and is no longer relevant. It is completely irrelevant. And so this distinction to al-Qaeda, which is the problem that the U.S. Republicans are having in Congress when they try to criticize Obama relative to his statements on the Benghazi attack, when you try to identify Islamic terrorism with al-Qaeda today, you go down a path where there is absolutely no substance. You're dealing with as big a myth as referring to people as Palestinians or a place called Palestine. It's completely a myth. There is no substance to it. There's really only one remaining original al-Qaeda member. Now, al-Qaeda was once meaningful. It became meaningful ever so briefly when Zbigniew Brzezinski, working for Jimmy Carter, decided that they could give the Russians a taste of what the Russians were delivering to us in Vietnam via a proxy war by using the Taliban through the Pakistani government to fight the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban was just a group of mujahideen, very similar to what they are today. But they had no organizational structure because the ISI, which is the intelligence arm of the Pakistani military, wasn't all that intelligent. So a fellow came up to Afghanistan that wanted to participate. His name was bin Laden. He was well-educated. He was the son of a very wealthy Saudi Arabian. In fact, the Saudi Arabian who was probably the closest to the Saud royal family. And he was reasonably skilled at computer technology, and he created a database of the names of foreign mujahideen, of foreign jihadists that could aid in the fight. And that database caused the CIA to call what Osama bin Laden was doing on behalf of the U.S. military and on behalf of the U.S. CIA, the base. For a brief time, they were meaningful because the United States provided $5 billion worth of advanced weaponry to them to attack the Soviet-backed government. Now, after that time, they became irrelevant, and they were made irrelevant by actions of King George I. When George Bush wanted to deny Saddam Hussein access to Saudi Arabia after he had invaded Kuwait, Osama bin Laden said, we just defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Let us attack Saddam Hussein. You see, al-Qaeda, Saddam Hussein, were absolute mortal enemies. And that was the case because Saddam Hussein was a secularist. And al-Qaeda are fundamentalist Muslims. They hated each other. And so Osama bin Laden wanted to go to war with them. He said he had a good case. He said, we just beat the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. We sure as heck can beat this puny Iraqi military. At the same time, King George I was trying to commit the U.S. military to attacking Saddam Hussein and chasing him out of Kuwait to keep him from capturing Saudi Arabia. That made Osama bin Laden very angry because the Sauds chose American weapons and the American military over mujahideen. And they did so because they knew that if they further empowered the jihadists in Saudi Arabia, that those jihadists would overthrow them. It's kind of like being a Mongol barbarian and not taking your fellow barbarians out to sack another community, because if you don't, they will sack you. And that's what they recognized. That was the brief time that al-Qaeda was meaningful. From that time on, they have been completely irrelevant, but because the media doesn't want to refer to Islam as the source of 99.9% of terrorist activity, they instead use this term al-Qaeda. And so now there's this myth being reported by Reuters in Syria that there has been fighting between the al-Qaeda jihadists and the I guess, moderate Syrian fighters, jihadists, that has come to a truce. And the fact is, there is no distinction between them. Well, let's continue with the article. As Syria's civil war gets even more complex amid a broad regional confrontation between Sunnis and Shiite Muslims, the United States raised the prospect of Assad's sponsor, Iran, the Shiite power long at odds with Washington and its Sunni Arab allies, playing some role in this month's Syrian peace talks. Now, think about this for a moment. The Syrian civil war is a proxy war. It's a proxy war that is being fought because the United States invaded Iraq. That is the sole cause of the Syrian civil war. The United States invaded Iraq, gave Iran's enemy to Iraq. So Iraq now is controlled entirely by the mullahs in Tehran. The Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, who runs Iraq, is an Iranian Shiite Muslim. And having done this, having removed Iran's only enemy and given the oil-rich country to Iran, the Iranians and Shiite Islam gained enormous influence in the Middle East. And even though Shia Muslims represent 10 to 15% of Muslims, the rise of Shia Islam from not only now Iran to now Iraq and into Syria, which was at one time an ally of Iraq but now must depend on Iran, and the destabilization in favor of Shia Muslims of Lebanon. The Sunnis, which outnumber the Shiites by 4 to 1 in the Middle East, are very concerned. So the United States triggered all of this, made this mess, and the Saudis and the Qataris in particular decided that they needed to thwart the rise of Shia Islam, and Sunni Muslims consider Shia Muslims to be apostates, worthy of death. They consider them worse than infidels. That there needed to be this proxy war, that Saudi Arabia and the Kuwaitis decided that when there was a popular and peaceful protest against the Assad government, that was their chance, and they armed the protesters. And what was a peaceful protest turned into a civil war, started by the Qataris, the gun runners of Sunni Islam, and the Saudi Arabians. The Iranians in this case are actually the victims. But the United States has not wanted them to participate in these talks because they are viewed as the enemy, even though they are the ones who were attacked. And so this situation is not complex. It is actually extraordinarily simple. It is a proxy war being fought between Sunni and Shiite Islam that was created because of the American invasion of Iraq when we gave Iraq to Iran. There is no good side here. The Sunni jihadists that are fighting for a singular cause, a cause which really has nothing to do with Syria. It has nothing to do with freedom. It has all to do with establishing a unified Islamic Caliphate, which means they have to completely destroy the influence of Shiite Islam so that all of Islam and all of the Middle East can unite under Sunni Islam and reestablish the Caliphate. What then, you may want to know. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. So as we are in literally a stew of myths in Syria, with so few people actually taking a step back to say, all right, I need some perspective on this. Who is doing what to whom and why? We have John Kerry trying to jump in and invite the Iranians to sit on the sidelines to discuss peace talks in Syria, when the Iranians are actually the victim of what is occurring in Syria. And of course, then you have the additional muddled mess, making Syria so incredibly caustic, of having Russia and China on the side of Syria, the Syrian government, and therefore Iran, because of their vital national interests in the Caspian Sea oil and gas reserves, which require a relationship with Iran for them to extract. Then the United States and Europe, being tighter with the Sauds and Kuwaitis than with the Iranians, are on the other side. So if, for example, if Obama had gotten his way when his red line was crossed and he began to bomb Damascus, he would have had to fly our bombers and missiles over Russian ships, and would have put the United States at odds also with its largest benefactor, China, and would have started not only World War III, but a cataclysmic depression, because we would not have been able to fund our deficit while making China our enemy. That's how complicated this is, in the sense of not complicated, I should say, but how significant this is in terms of its consequences. And each action has to be circumspect under these circumstances because of how big a mess this is. And what you recognize is that if the Sunnis prevail, and the 85% are able to reassert their influence over the 15%, there will be a caliphate established, and with the caliphate established, Muslims in unison will declare war on Israel. That war is depicted in the prophets. It's called the Magog War. It begins World War III. It's a devastating time for planet Earth. God predicts that during that war, in the first phase, 1 out of every 4 people on the planet will die, and in the second phase, 1/3 of the people on the planet will die. This is a very significant event. This is the fire that we're playing with. Now, as we consider this misreporting on it, the realization is that it is Syria right now is serving as the throttle mechanism on jihadi Islam's ultimate goal. There's only one thing that unifies all Muslims, Sunni and Shiite, and that is their hatred for Israel and for Jews. And as we know, that is because the Quran is a more anti-Semitic book than was Hitler's Mein Kampf. But right now, rather than unifying in their hatred of Jews and Israel, Muslims are fighting one another. Sunnis and Shias, they're at each other's throats. This was the throttling mechanism for the Magog War that was predicted by Yahowah many thousands of years ago when he spoke of Ishmael's descendants. Ishmael is the claimed forefather of Islam, that they would be wild asses of men, that their hands would be raised against their brothers' hands would be raised against them while they live in hostility with the whole world. The throttling mechanism of Muslims killing Muslims in Syria is literally the throttling mechanism that is postponing, at least for another 15 years or so, the Magog War. That is what we're witnessing here. And for us to intervene in this, we will create another disaster. We will simply make a bad situation worse, as we did in Afghanistan, as we did in Egypt, as we did in Iraq, as we did in Libya. And so the only intelligent thing that the United States can do at this point is to stop providing arms to the Sunnis that want to establish the caliphate, to stop antagonizing Iran, and to recognize that the United States can do nothing positive here, and everything that the United States has attempted to do in the Islamic world has backfired. 100% of our endeavors have served to make bad situations infinitely worse. And we've spilled our children's blood and trillions of dollars of coin in the process. It's time that we all stand up to our government and say no more. I don't want you to be involved in any conversation or in any weaponization of the Islamic world. We'll be back after the news and commercial break.